Ever wondered what happened when a bunch of snotty kids grabbed cheap guitars, 3 basic chords, and decide to blow up rock and roll from the inside? Welcome to punk. Short, loud, and unapologetically chaotic. The 1970s rebellion that screamed do-it-yourself against everything polished and pretentious. Whether you're picturing safety pins and spit, or just curious about the Ramones, Sex Pistols and Clash anthems that changed music forever, we've got it all. So strap in for riffs, rants and a raucous laugh through the anarchy. This is Start Here, the podcast from the Associated Board of the Royal Schools of Music, with me, Alexis Ffrench, and this is really about getting under the skin of a genre. I'm a classical pianist, composer and producer and can talk endlessly about those worlds. But what about the worlds of disco, gospel, heavy metal? I'm so excited to get into all of these genres on this season of Start Here. My expert for this episode is none other than the amazing Alexis Petridis. He's head rock and pop journalist and critic for The Guardian. And I would say that this being punk, there is some strong language, so please do take care listening. Alexis.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Hello. I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, amazing. So good to be in your company.
I'm absolutely delighted to be here. So thank you for having me.
Amazing. Thanks, Alexis. So we kick off all our episodes asking for the hard sell, which is your elevator pitch for punk. The floor is yours, Alexis.
You should keep elevator pitches as brief as possible. So what I would say, the reason you should listen to punk rock, or there's 2 reasons you should listen to punk rock. One is that at its best, it is the potent, distilled essence of rock and roll in its most, undiluted, basic and powerful form. Also, punk is nearly 50 years old as a genre. It'll be 50 years old later this year. If you take it. And in that 50 years, it has changed and mutated and altered in some ways almost beyond recognition. And I would say that at any point, if you dip into punk from a certain era, whether that era is the mid-70s or it's the mid-80s or it's last week, it will tell you something about its era and it will tell you something about the place that it is made. And I think that's a really valuable thing.
Brilliant pitch, Alexis. Thanks so much for that. So, bit of context then. Where does punk sit in the musical canon?
Well, that's a good question. Where does punk sit within the musical canon? It starts, no question about this, it really starts in the form that we now think of it in New York in the mid-70s. But it very quickly comes to Britain. And there is a lot of argument and to and fro about the extent of American punk's influence on British punk. British punk is a slightly different beast than American punk. And that is because Britain in the mid-70s is a very different place from America in the mid-70s. So American punk is, let's call it a kind of back to basics movement. The general feeling is that rock music has become too grandiose, too remote. And in America, the idea is sort of let's go back to the 50s and 60s, but with a slightly different spin. So it's short, 3 chords, distorted guitars. You can trace its roots back to early rock and roll, to glam rock. It's got a little bit of kind of the mid-60s in there as well. But, it also sounds current and it sounds modern.
Yeah.
Punk takes off in Britain, and it is much more reactionary to its environment. It's, Britain in the mid-70s is an exceptionally grim place. I mean, you're talking about a country where there is a financial crisis, where there is a lot of industrial action and disruption, where there is a mainland terrorist bombing campaign happening for the first time, which is, pretty terrifying. And also a country where there is very little apparently going on if you're young. There are 3 TV channels and the TV goes off at midnight. Everywhere shuts at 11 o'clock. It is. I'm sure you can recall the abject misery of a wet Sunday in the sort of late 70s and early 80s, where it's just there's just nothing to do. Everything is closed apart from the garden centre. And punk is a sort of, there is a sense in British culture, and this goes across from music into film and comics and comedy, of a kind of fury and a sort of nihilism, a sort of nihilistic anger, that ultimately finds its most potent expression in the Sex Pistols. There are lots of other people who, it sort of keeps cropping up in music, and is that a bit of it? Is that? And then suddenly the Sex Pistols appear, and it all appears to be distilled into what they're doing and saying. So that gives it a sort of an extra kind of potency. There is a famous BBC TV programme, a sort of panel discussion about punk, where the presenter says at the beginning, to some people, this is a bigger threat to the sort of moral fabric of Britain than communism. Wow. That's pretty
some
serious.
Some statements.
Some statements.
I know. I've spent the last couple of days listening to as much punk as I can lay my hands on.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if it's great or not, but that's what I've been doing. And do you know, it's interesting though with the Ramones. The first thing that struck me, it was, and you will please correct my pronunciation, Blitzkrieg Bop.
Blitzkrieg Bop, yeah. Absolutely. Right, yeah, that's a good starting point.
Yeah. The first thing, there was this moment lyrically where lead singer, would that be Phil Ramone?
That's Joey Ramone.
Joey Ramone. So the lead singer just basically comes in with the most beautiful, mellifluously shaped phrase. It's very folky-esque. And there's to me, it presents somewhat of a sort of dissonance with the rest of everything. There's sort of chaos that's going on.
That's interesting.
Right, yeah,
okay.
and almost Schubertian in a sense. Such was its lyricism. Just for this the briefest of moments, Alexis. But I and then it sort of went on. I was listening through the playlist, and everything that I would expect from punk, it delivered. But in that first track, for me, was a track of intense contradiction. And I really, really enjoyed it for that reason. I enjoyed the contradictions in that track. But can you tell us, before we get into, I guess, the foundations of punk, can you tell us a little bit about how the Sex Pistols, a brief version of how the Sex Pistols came to be, and also how the Ramones seem to be, because they seem to me somewhat foundational in punk's evolution.
They are absolutely foundational. The Ramones were 4 guys from Queens, sort of varying degrees of kind of juvenile delinquency. The sliding scale would be Dee Dee Ramone, who was the bass player, who really was a juvenile delinquent, and had had a sort of fairly extraordinary life, had worked as a male prostitute, was a drug addict, to Joey Ramone, who is a sort of kind of dork. He's the singer. He's a kind of dorky, sort of incredibly tall, sort of struggles a bit on stage because he's so tall. And some of them had been in bands previously, like a glam rock band called Sniper. And somehow the 4 of them together, which often happens in great bands, was greater than the sum of its parts, It's basic, stripped down, 3-chord rock and roll, leather jackets. Their dress, the way they dress, is sort of based on the way that rent boys in New York would dress. They had rips in their jeans, which were known as hustler rips, because you would spend so much time on your knees.
Okay.
So it's quite a striking thing.
Yeah.
Right. The Sex Pistols are, again, juvenile delinquency is a part of this. They are people who are hanging around a clothes shop, at the World's End of the King's Road, which is owned by Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood. Steve Jones, who's the guitarist, first comes to the notice because he's trying to shoplift items from the clothing store. And they are sort of put together by Malcolm McLaren. There are 4 people. It's not like they grew up together. Steve Jones and Paul Cook, the drummer, did. But he brings in John Lydon, who Johnny Rotten, as he's known, and a guy called Glenn Matlock, who plays the bass. And it's immediately very, very combustible. They don't really get on. Malcolm McLaren has this sort of background in sort of student radicalism, situationism. He's less interested in music than causing a fuss, than offense, whatever, disrupting the spectacle, as Guy Debord would say, you know?
Yeah.
And so that's where they come from. They are kind of the time, seen as having very limited musical ability. John Lydon can't really sing in any accepted sense, but finds this sort of weird 2-note thing, almost like let's say Middle Eastern kind of ululating kind of sound that he makes, that is perfect for conveying sort of contempt and anger, which is really what he has to offer. He's a ferociously intelligent but completely undereducated man who feels that he has been really, really let down by the class system, let down by his schooling, all those things. And there's a great line about Rotten. The writer John Savage compared him to Pinky from Brighton Rock and said, like Pinky, he was ready to murder a world. And I think that's just, brilliant.
Raw, absolutely raw. So thinking about musical definitions and the origin, we always segue to this this particular part of the show. And chordally, without getting too musicological, chordally and structurally, what would one generally expect to hear in a sort of standard punk track?
3 chords, 1, 3, 5. Would that be right? If it's in C, it would be C, F, and G.
So 1, 4, 5. Yeah.
1, 4, 5. Sorry, yeah. I'm no musicologist.
No, that's not right.
You would expect to hear distorted guitars. You would expect to hear kind of, again, it doesn't sound fast by modern standards, but it sounded incredibly fast then. You'd expect to hear sort of root note bass lines. You would not expect anything particularly flashy. You would not expect kind of, unbelievable technical proficiency, complex soloing, very little improvisation.
And is that the point? Is that the whole point, or is it a big part of it?
It's part of the point.
The absence of virtuosity.
The absence of virtuosity is a huge part of
is
the
an
point.
essential ingredient.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because one of the reasons it proliferates so quickly is because it is music that you don't need to have studied your instrument for years and years and years to play.
Yeah.
There is a famous thing in a punk fanzine called the fanzine's called Sideburns, where it's 1 page and it has 3 chord diagrams on it. Again, 1, 4, 5. And it says, here's a chord, here's another, here's a third one, now form a band. Which is sort of brilliant. I mean, I know it's probably anathema to you, but it's kind of like, I think that notion of it being accessible.
Yeah, I love that.
Is something, it's like, no, if you have something to say, you have the right to get up on stage and say it.
Yeah.
And I think, the value of that you can ultimately question, but I think in that moment it's kind of needed. Getting up and doing something for yourself is that ever a bad idea? Rather than sitting around waiting to be entertained?
So we talk about US and UK politically. What was going on at that time? What was this music a response to in terms of
in America? I really do see. I mean, there's all sorts of things going on in America. We've come out of an oil crisis. You've just come out of the kind of Nixon years have just ended. I think in America it is more of a reaction to the music that was popular. In Britain, as I said, it's a reaction to the music that was popular and to the notion of life in Britain at that point, or the notion of what you might expect as a young person in Britain at that point. And it is also very much in Britain, more so than in America, a kind of deliberate attempt to outrage people and upset people. And some of that upset now can look in some ways, some of it's terrible. I mean, you look at there's a lot of proliferation of people wearing swastikas, which is kind of indefensible. I mean, I think the Second World War and Nazism was viewed slightly differently at that point. And contextually, you've got to think you'd have a comedian like Freddie Starr on the TV. You have this kind of funny dressing up as Hitler routine, which you wouldn't get today. But equally, it's difficult to justify. In Britain, they're big people. People at gigs are big on spitting at the bands. That again, I find quite difficult to sort of understand.
I've heard that the ritual spitting isn't actually. It's not meant to cause any sort of upset, or it's intended to be some sort of part of some kind of ritual practice where people are welcomed into the bosom of the punk fraternity. Is that right, or am I wrong? Or
I think so. I think it's some sort of perverse form of appreciation. It's just one of those things you look at now, and it's just like, why on earth would you do that? So yeah, that's a kind of an aspect of it that I struggle to get my head around. But it's always good. I think nowadays it's very easy to listen to, because it's 50 years old and it's become just part of the musical landscape.
Yeah,
to listen to punk and think, oh, people are so upset by this, because people were really, really, really angry about it. And maybe something like that, you get a sort of little flavor of why, of transgression or something that makes you go, oh, right, okay. And it's a tiny little taste of how people felt about it then. It is ultimately, the initial sort of use of the swastika is about shock tactics. The clothes that were coming out of McLaren and Westwood's boutique sex were deliberately designed to shock people in any way they could. And again, a lot of it now you look at and go, oh my God, I suppose it's still got the power to shock. The most awful sort of side effect of it was that, and also you are living in a time of when the National Front are very much on the rise in Britain, and the Sex Pistols, to their immense credit, the minute the National Front, people try to associate them with the National Front, they absolutely and unequivocally distance themselves from it. Johnny Rotten's line is like, I have nothing to do with that scummy organisation. But what the National Front are able to do is to find actual racists who will form punk bands on their behalf. And that mainly happens in Leeds, and something called Rock Against Communism starts, fronted by largely forgotten bands called the Dentists and the Vents. And ultimately there's this band called Screwdriver, who are a kind of fairly hopeless punk band, who are, very, very right wing, very racist. And they ultimately become the figureheads of this. So what the use of the swastika does is, I think it gives a gateway for that to happen, and that's not good. That's a really, really appalling thing to do. And I think there's an element of just stupidity and naivety about it. That there comes a point where it's like anything, isn't it? The shock tactics are great. It's good to shake people up, but when it has that kind of effect in the real world, that's pretty awful.
Yeah, yes, indeed. Now we've touched base on some of the characters, that lit punk's fuse. Johnny Rotten, fascinating man. Joey Ramone, larger than life characters. Tell us about some of your favourites of that time and why they are.
I love the idea of Johnny Rotten just because I said that the American thing about punk was, let's sort of make it all a bit more like the 60s, mid 60s. And in Britain, it's more of a kind of scorched earth thing. It's like everything that happened before is rubbish. I don't have any heroes. They're all useless, as Rotten says at one point. And I'm fascinated by that one person can just become this kind of genuine kind of lightning conductor, for good or bad. I mean, the guy was attacked. He attempted to go to the pub opposite Wessex Studios in the summer of 1977, and he was surrounded by people and attacked with a machete. That's how much people dislike Johnny Rotten. Other figures that are great. I love Joe Strummer, who is the singer of The Clash, who is a much more... he's a more kind of impassioned figure. He really believes in music's ability to change things. Great band, The Clash. I love Pete Shelley, who's the singer of the Buzzcocks, who's another fascinating guy. Is sort of bisexual. He's called Pete Shelley because Shelley is the name that he would have been given if he was a girl. He writes these genderless love songs. I think that's an amazing, they're sort of quite camp sounding in a way, but they're kind of punk. They're really punky as well. It just seems to me that lots and lots of interesting people get involved in it. There's a band called The Slits, who are an all-female band. Their lead singer is 14 years old. And they're extraordinary. If you listen to the 2 Peel sessions the Slits did in 1978, these are people who genuinely have no idea how to play. And somehow that leads them to make completely original music. The drummer is not playing in any way like a normal drummer would. Everything's a bit all over the place, but it's also sort of like, this is just totally different to any. It's not just a noise. It's like, this is different to anything I've ever heard. And I find that in some ways that's the anyone can do it promise of punk made real. It's like, wow, they hit on something incredible here. I cannot recommend those. It's only 7 songs, but I cannot recommend them highly enough.
I was reading about King's Road is somewhere where I used to frequent actually when I was.
Oh, really?
It was because it was no longer the King's Road as it was, but it was still a thing to go to the King's Road and go shopping. So I used to go down there simply to say that I'd been and buy clothes, but it lost its luster, particularly since Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren. But the idea of music and fashion. Is very much part of punk's story, particularly in the UK, isn't it? Can you just talk us through that a little?
Okay, so the clothes that McLaren and Westwood were designing had elements of kind of fetish wear and bondage and stuff like that about them. Trousers with straps that kind of constricted your legs, leather, rubber, this kind of thing. The other thing that sort of doesn't really have to do with McLaren and Westwood, other than the fact that McLaren saw it and kind of brought the idea back to England. There was a band in New York called Television, and their bass player was a guy called Richard Hell. And by common consent, he was the first person. He saw himself as this sort of Rimbaud-esque kind of, poet maudit figure. And one of the ways he expressed this was ripping his clothes up, holding them back together again with safety pins. He used to walk around New York with a T-shirt that said, "Please kill me," on the front, which is somebody said, in New York in the mid-70s, you really weren't supposed to, And so that idea of kind of ripped clothes, safety pins, sort of recycle. Again, it comes back to that do-it-yourself idea. The clothes that McLaren and Westwood were selling were really expensive. And very quickly, people realized you could have some sort of peculiar knockoff version of that just by going to a charity shop or raiding your parents' wardrobe and, I suppose the big thing that changes is flared trousers. They're very much against the idea of flared trousers. And that's, something that actively, because by sort of 1980, or 81, no one in Britain is wearing flared trousers.
Okay, presumably that's because of anti-glam rock kind of era, is it?
Kind of, anti just kind of hippie more than anything. There's a hippie-ish kind of take it easy. Joe Strummer famously said, "Like trousers, like brain," which is doesn't really make any sense because obviously if your trousers are narrower, that means your brain is narrow.
Yeah,
should we praise one? I think that's one of the things that kind of. People are also looking for. We don't really have spectacular youth cultures anymore. They're not something that particularly exist in 2026. But that sort of notion of identifying yourself, tribal, being part of a tribe, is really appealing to people. Although by all accounts, dressing in that way in Britain in the mid-70s, you were probably going to get hit. Someone, you were going to get hiding at some point, But I guess there's an element of kind of bravado about that sort of peacocking. I don't know. But yeah, it is a really important part of it, because it automatically identifies you as part of this thing that is deemed this huge threat to the fabric of British society.
Yeah, absolutely. So punk thrived on this sort of bad boy bad boy spirit, shall we say. But there are some brilliant female misfits as well. When I'm thinking of people like Polly, do correct my pronunciation, Polly Styrene.
Yeah, she's fabulous.
Ari Up, the Slits, etc., who broke every rule. And how did the mainstream audiences react to these fabulous female artists who came along within the world of punk?
Surprisingly, I think people really respected them, because a lot of the time, those female artists, were doing something noticeably different. Polly Styrene, who is
brilliant name, just absolutely brilliant,
amazing name, and part of a sort of broader. Her name is part of a broader kind of aesthetic that her band X-Ray Specs have. She writes a lot of songs about sort of consumerism, the day the world turned day glow. She looks extraordinary. She has braces on her teeth. She's mixed race. She sort of wears a cardigan and has this little plastic handbag she carries with her, and has this sort of incredible voice. They're one of the bands, I think, X-Ray Specs, that really, really, really stand up. Right. Ari Up, who was the singer I mentioned, the Slits, who was 14. They're these kind of wild-looking women with sort of matted hair, and they seem. Punk appears, to give female artists more space to express themselves in a way that they perhaps weren't able to express themselves previously. It's not about fitting into the standard, roles for women in music prior to punk. And this is no disrespect to those artists, but it's kind of the folky, singer-songwriter writing, quiet sort of confessional songs, or this kind of sexy front lady, whatever. They don't fit with any of that. And that's a sort of real, I'm not sure that day-to-day life as a woman on the punk scene was a bed of roses. I think those kind of ingrained male attitudes were very much there. But in terms of kind of, they seem to become kind of figureheads, really, to me, quite quickly. Susie from Susie and the Banshees is another good case in point. There's a lot of strong women involved in punk, and a lot of women who didn't fit in anywhere else. There is a slight element of, bring me your weirdos, bring me your, bring me your freaks, bring me whatever. And I think that's great.
And if you could sort of trace that sort of canonic arc from those heavy-hitting sort of punk women from back in the day to now, who would you draw a sort of association with, that connective tissue? Who would you say still retains?
Now?
Yeah. Who would you say still retains some of that punk spirit? On the female side of things.
The way punk has sort of percolated down into the present day is kind of absolutely fascinating, I think, in that it has really infiltrated pop music. So you would have a figure like Olivia Rodrigo, who you would never say is particularly, does she have anything to do with polystyrene? Well, on one level, not really. She's a former Disney star, and so on and so forth. But her sound is very influenced by kind of what you call pop punk, which has its roots in the Ramones. Maybe we'll talk about the sort of how this develops. There is a certain element of her behavior that is not perhaps what you would expect from an artist like that. When the Roe versus Wade decision passed in America, she came on stage Glastonbury. I believe she read out the name of every judge involved in that decision, and then sang a cover of Lily Allen's song "Fuck You," which I thought, wow, you didn't need to do that. You know what I mean? That's that you did that because. So obviously her music doesn't sound like the Slits, but the way it's kind of infiltrated pop music, or a certain area of pop music, which is broadly, female fronted, broadly, women are in charge of pop music at the moment. I think that's where you can sort of trace its real impact and influence.
That's an interesting one. I wasn't expecting you to say Olivia Rodrigo, but I could definitely see it. Now, Alexis, I'm curious to know: can punk exist within other genres of music. I think we spent a little time talking about what punk is. Is it constrained within the fabric of these four chords, i.e., this sort of this rarefied territory, the absence of virtuosity, amped up guitars, these charismatic frontmen and women, or can it exist within other genres of music? What are your thoughts on that?
I think you can. There's two ways you can look at punk, and you can look at punk as what you were just saying. You know, three chords. What we've been talking about, three chords, distorted guitars. You can also talk about punk as simply an attitude, and you know, I would argue that, excuse my language, if punk is an attitude, it's doing what you want to do with zero fucks given. You know, and that can be true of all sorts of different kinds of music. You know. It is too pat to say that hip hop is the black punk, but what hip hop does do is bring a sort of very authentic street vernacular into the absolute dead center of pop music. You know, it also gives a voice to people. You know, if you talk to someone like Chuck D from Public Enemy, he would say that, you know, it gave a voice to people that didn't previously have a voice within music. You know, again, the DIY thing, literally making music out of records, you know, out of other people's records. It doesn't get much, you know, having a set of turntables that you've taken the electricity from a street lamp to run and playing in a park with people rapping over the top of it. It doesn't get any more punk than that. The other sort of, I suppose, the genre that really collides with punk, in a weird way, it's sort of just a circumstantial thing, is reggae. Reggae's impact on punk is enormous. One account is simply that Don Letts, black British guy who was sort of involved in the punk scene, but was also a friend of Bob Marley's, for example, was the resident DJ at the punk club, the Roxy. And his line was that he simply didn't have, there weren't enough punk records for him to play. So he played reggae. And if you think about reggae in the mid-70s, this is the absolute height of roots reggae. If you think about punk as railing against the machine, you know, or railing against the state of things, nothing rails against the state of things with quite the same sort of vociferous power as roots reggae in that period, because these are people that are doing this with literally religious conviction. The sort of first band that really take it on are the Clash, and they really dive wholeheartedly into it. They record, they do reggae covers, they go to Jamaica to record, they work with Lee Scratch Perry, the reggae producer. Don Letts, when Bob Marley comes to England, he sort of flees Jamaica after an assassination attempt. He holds up in London where he makes the album Exodus, and he sees Don Letts, and he says something like, you know, what are you doing with these dirty punk rockers, you know? And Don Letts goes, no, you know, this is, you know, you don't understand these people. It's like our struggle as well. They see our struggle, and and as a result of that, Bob Marley writes, and it's not the greatest Bob Marley record of all time, but it's incredibly well-meaning, Punky Reggae Party, which is this absolute attempt where he mentions the Wailers will be there, the Jam, the Clash, you know, he mentions all these reggae bands. And also it gave a stage, you know, reggae bands were perfectly happy to share a stage with punk bands like Misty and Roots. So that is a really important kind of, you know, confluence. And I think I would, you know, outside of London, I think a lot of people would have discovered, a lot of certainly white audiences would have discovered reggae and discovered sort of, you know, for my money, some of the greatest reggae records, albums of all time are made in that sort of 76, 77 era. My favourite reggae album is 27's Clash by Culture, which was a huge record among punks. It doesn't sound anything like punk. It sounds like roots reggae. But it's absolutely boiling with fury.
Oh, I love that.
You know,
yeah.
So yeah, I cannot recommend, if you're going to listen to a reggae, listen to the title track of 27's Clash by Culture. They absolutely sang that song in the belief that Babylon was about to fall and Rasta would be free. And there's something so immensely powerful, and it's also beautiful. The vocals are just beautiful on it.
How does punk's sort of DIY attitude, how has it shaped the music? So not necessarily musically, but how has it shaped the landscape, contemporary musical landscape in the present day, would you say?
Well, I would say that what basically happens both in Britain and America, and this is really important, in some ways more important than the music in terms of going forward, is that because of this kind of DIY idea, you can start your own record label, you can, book your own shows, you can do all this kind of thing. A kind of network emerges in both countries. First of all, actually, primarily in Britain, if you look at the years sort of 1979 to 1982, which are often held up as this great era, God, the charts were so vibrant, right? The reason the charts are so vibrant is because of punk, although none of the artists we're talking about will be considered punk. None of the things like two-tone, the sort of big explosion of synth pop that happens, all these things that we see as making that era exciting, they wouldn't have happened without punk, because they primarily are started by people starting their own record labels, people who feel able to start their own bands, people that are motivated to start their own bands, start their own. And there is a kind of network that emerges of kind of independent labels, smaller venues, really supported by the music press, that becomes hugely important and influential. And in America, I would say it's even more so. Punk gets sort of bigger in America in the early 80s. It's kind of largely ignored at first. America's a big country. Something happening in New York is not necessarily going to take off anywhere else. The punk scene in California is a punk scene in New York. Elsewhere, not so much. But something called hardcore punk emerges in America around sort of 1980. Faster, harder. It's a sort of, in some ways, a response to the rise of Reagan, I think, and a network of small gigs, small labels, magazines emerges out of that ultimately, and it's a slightly serpentine path, but ultimately leads to Nirvana, leads to the arrival of Nirvana. There is a reason why the documentary about Nirvana that comes out is called 1991, the year punk broke. So, would Nirvana have existed without this sort of structure behind them? I don't necessarily think so, So that is the kind of a sort of historical thing. Nowadays, I guess we are living that anyone can do it punk ethos. We really are living in an era where anyone can do it because the tools are there, because it's very easy to make music in your bedroom, because you don't even need to form a band. You don't need to have a record label. You upload it to SoundCloud, you upload it wherever. I would argue that's proved something of a double-edged sword.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Yeah.
Anyone can do. Anyone may be able to do it. That doesn't necessarily mean that anyone should. And if you sort of think about that kind of deluge, we live in a. Punk is a music that comes out of scarcity and focus. Right? There are fewer opportunities. There are fewer whatever. People fixate on this one thing. We now live in a time of cultural abundance and no focus whatsoever. So I think that, has an impact.
So much information, so much good stuff here, so much brilliant stuff, actually. I can't wait to dive into some of these bands, particularly Polystyrene, who I've learnt about today for the first time. Where should people start, in your opinion, Alexis, where should people start their punk journey? If you were to pick, we've probably named quite a few of them today, if you were to pick maybe 3 or 4 artists or bands where people could start their sort of foundational journey getting into this whole world.
Okay. I would say foundational artist bands. The Ramones, obviously. If I had to recommend one Ramones album, I wouldn't necessarily... their debut is brilliant. Their first 3 albums are all brilliant, but their third album, Rocket to Russia, is the album where they hone what they do to a point of just total perfection for me. And also, if you hear that album now, bear in mind that album was recorded in 1977. If that album came out today, it sounds current, it sounds modern, because pop punk, which ultimately leads back to the Ramones, is still sort of part of the musical landscape. There are bands that sound a bit like that. There are pop artists that sound a bit like that now. I would say, obviously the Sex Pistols, again, handily, most of the great stuff is all on their debut album, Nevermind the Bollocks. If you want to get a sense of punk as something that really upset people, get a little sense memory of that. Listen to a track from that called Bodies, which is a thoroughly disturbing, still, and sort of it kind of frightening piece of music. I would suggest, if you want to see how a punk band could develop, listen to the third album by The Clash, London Calling, which came out in 1979, which is a double album and is an absolute sort of smorgasbord of different musical styles. There's tracks that sound like reggae, there's tracks that sound like rockabilly. London Calling is soup to nuts brilliant, filled with absolutely fantastic songs. It's got killer kind of punk tracks on it. It's got tracks that sound like Motown. It's just like, God, what this band could do at that moment. And then, if you're talking about, let's talk a little bit about hardcore, because that is really important. And if you wanted to listen to a hardcore album, I would recommend the debut album by a group called Bad Brains, which comes out in, I think, 1981 or 1982. It's just called Bad Brains. And Bad Brains are fascinating. They are an all-black Rastafarian hardcore punk band from Washington.
Interesting.
And their music is, you wouldn't believe that a band that flipped between playing hardcore, which is really fast, like that, they flip between doing that and playing kind of reggae. You wouldn't believe that works as well as it does. That is an extraordinary album and is hugely influential on people like anybody who's into hardcore that comes later. Bands like the Beastie Boys, who start out as a hardcore punk band. The amount of respect that album and that Bad Brains command is off the scale. So that will be another one. That's four.
That's really good. We're in very good shape here. Amazing. You have given us a lot of homework there, Alexis, and I shall get on with this tonight. It's been an absolute delight to speak to you, Alexis. Alexis Petridis, thank you so much for your time. Can't wait for part 2.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Start Here, which is brought to you by the Associated Board of the Royal Schools of Music. If you like punk, then you might enjoy grunge or heavy metal, both on this series of Start Here. Also, check out our other 2 series, covering everything from K-pop to musical theatre to gaming music. Follow ABRSM on TikTok or Instagram and tell us what genre of music you want to be unpacked next.